started for tonight. I printed my remarks really big so I wouldn't have to wear my glasses, and I'm thinking that maybe I might even, but I'll try not to. Welcome to CCA's Interior Design Lecture Series and to our opening lecture for the fall semester 2013. Our lecture series this year is generously funded by the IIDA, the International Interior Design Association, who has made a very generous gift to CCA at the titanium level. It is their hope and mine and ours that the series will help us facilitate productive communication between the IIDA industry professionals in the Bay Area and our students. So I hope that you will put the interior design lectures on your calendars. And perhaps even join us regularly in Timken on Monday evenings at 7, where there will be a lecture from today till the end of the semester. So definitely come and see what's happening in this room at 7 on Monday nights. As you see scrolling by, I also wanted to alert you all to what I think is a great exhibition of student work that's currently open at the Museum of Craft and Design, which is just down the street on 3rd Street, very nearby. The museum has also been very generous with us, given us a really great space for this work, and has granted free admission to CCA students from now until November 3rd. So please go over there. The Young Designers Show features work from the interior design program and will be running in conjunction with the New West Coast Design 2 show, which opens on October 25th. So please put that on your calendars. I wanted to also thank our faculty, Megan Werner and Margot Majuska, who designed, curated, and mounted the show that's at the museum. So now I'd like to introduce our lecturers for tonight. Jason Logan and Matthew Johnson have a firm called LOJO in Houston, Texas. In touring them through the school today, it turns out they know quite a few of our faculty already, but I didn't hear of them through our faculty, as is sometimes the case, but I found out about them, I think, in the best possible way through their work. Last year, the Sierra Club contacted CCA, I think spoke to Chip, actually, first, and asked CCA to build on this really cool lobby space that they had that was really rebranding their whole kind of woodsy John Muir brand, 18th century kind of brand, and changing the look of the Sierra Club and really its mission from one of kind of camping and preserving the wilderness to really being an advocate for the wilderness. And so it became a kind of activist organization, and they needed a new space and recognized that they needed a new space. So CCA students took that on. We visited the space, we did case studies on the project, and everything that it was meant to be that didn't quite make it to construction. But that was how I found out about their work and looked on their website and saw that they were really interested in a lot of things that we were interested in at CCA in the interior design program. They want to deal with the idea of conditioning the environment, the interior environment, cleansing interior air, but also kind of priming the site for new work. And so working in what they say, and I think everyone will agree, is a very hot and humid place in Houston, they understood that conditioning involves thinking about the ecology of interiors, which is, I think, something that I hadn't really seen put in quite that way before. That the ecology of interiors and the boundary that separates interior from exterior has a real potential in interior design. It's a way of understanding maybe these kind of quick temporary sites, in a way giving agency to the way in which materials are used, the way in which the process of design is undertaken to address the role or the agency that an interior might have on the external environment. And so I found that super interesting, and I hope they'll they'll expand on that a little bit tonight. And just to tell you a little bit about them both, Matt Johnson worked for Allied Works Architecture on the Museum of Arts and Design, the Seattle Art Museum, and the University of Michigan Art Museum, among other projects. He also worked for Stephen Hall on the MIT Simmons Hall Dormitory, which I know a lot of you are familiar with from case studies as well. And the Turbulence House and various competitions, and he's currently an assistant professor at the University of Houston. Jason Logan before founding LOJO, worked for Gensler, where he was involved in a range of project types, including Hilton Americas, the Anadarko Tower, Del Mar Community College Public Safety Classroom and Laboratory, and a Quest Diagnostics Laboratory. And he is also teaching at University of Houston College of Architecture as an adjunct professor in the graduate and undergraduate divisions or studios. And I'm really glad that they're here, and I hope they're enjoying the San Francisco weather. So please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you, Catherine. You guys are gonna know. Uh-oh. Yeah. Do I remember my password? Okay. So thank you, Catherine and CCA for having us here. We're really excited to be here. We really love being in San Francisco, partly because of the weather, but also the great food and for a variety of other reasons. We've been practicing together for a couple of years. We met at the University of Houston. And one of the things that is, it takes a practice a while to kind of figure out what its motivation is, but one of the things that we've been really interested in is this idea of conditioning. And I think initially this probably grew out of an interest in the idea of conditioning in Houston, which generally means air conditioning, because it's the most air-conditioned city in the world. But as we delved a little bit deeper into the work that we were doing and we started to do more projects, we realized that this notion of conditioning could actually be extended to a variety of other areas. So you can think about cities as massive conditioned spaces with a kind of an aggregated system of conditioning. You can think about interiors.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Being a kind of a conditioned space, and this idea that every unit in the world, in some sense, has an air conditioner built into it. You can think of the idea of conditioning sites and priming sites for future development. You can think of the idea of conditioning bodies, and that's not only in terms of weightlifting, but also this idea that somehow space and architecture actually conditions people in the ways that they use spaces and they move their bodies through spaces. And then there's the kind of Pavlovian idea of conditioning, which is that you condition a response to an external motivation or impetus. And finally, there's this idea at a much larger scale of conditioning atmospheres. And we're interested in the idea that you make architecture, but it actually extends out beyond let's say the building or the interior that you're making to the surrounding environment. So one great example of that, we think, is to look at Beijing as an example where the city itself there's a kind of a cloud cover in the city, but a lot of what seems to be cloud cover within the city is actually obviously smog. And so you get this condition where people in Beijing actually are trying to kind of modify the weather. In fact, there's an agency in Beijing called the China Weather Modification Service that actually during the Olympics seeded the clouds with silver iodide in order to essentially keep smog and rainstorms at bay and keep them out of the city so that they'd have clear weather for the opening days of the ceremonies. But as the events went on, obviously they couldn't kind of continually seed the clouds, so suddenly this stuff kind of moved back in, and they got this sort of excessive smog. And what's interesting about that is this notion that people living in Beijing have to kind of modify their behaviors in some sense to accommodate the weather.
And I think, as a practice, we're interested in that, the way in which culture can absorb these conditions. Even the sort of perverse idea that the air has become so toxic that it's not sort of safe for you to breathe, but that culture begins to absorb these conditions, and then there's a kind of even aesthetic project that emerges from it. So you see the female on the right who begins to even design the face mask that she needs to wear throughout the city.
And the other thing that's happened in Beijing as a kind of a strange corollary to all of this is that people living in the city have actually become obsessed with air purification systems. So I heard an anecdote that at parties in Beijing, people will discuss what kinds of air purification they have in their houses in the same way that in the U.S. we might discuss our cars or our bikes. And so I thought, this is sort of an interesting piece. Untitled does a lot of pieces that have to do with this notion of conditioning and of kind of using the implements of conditioning or the technologies of conditioning to kind of, create these new sort of installation projects.
So, I think we recognize within our work that, we strive for our projects to be informed by a global practice, and all of the discourse and the technologies that are, sort of being passed within this global environment. But we recognize also that we work very specifically within a kind of a region within this global environment. And very specifically that of Houston. And so we've been, as of probably the past year or two, trying to figure out how this notion of conditioning can further begin to inform the work that we've been doing and that we hope to continue doing in the future. And for us, I think whether it's the simple structures of the Ramada, which would have been out in West Texas, our biggest challenge in this region is that because of all the latent heat in the air and the humidity that we have, a lot of the passive strategies that would work in other places don't work in the Gulf Coast region. So whether it's also the dog trots, which would be a part of that Gulf Coast region that you would have found before air conditioning, we're interested in how architecture responded prior to air conditioning to try and make interior and sort of interior and exterior environments more comfortable. And not because we're interested in being mimetic or quoting these architectures directly, but I think we have an interest in the performative aspects of these projects, and also the spatial potentials that emerge from these, and also the thermodynamic potentials that emerge from these.
Well, and I think, for those two vernacular images, what's sort of interesting is that in a hot, humid climate, essentially, you want shading and you want breezes, you want a kind of a porous envelope. So in a way, you could argue that those vernacular types work against the idea of an interior. Leaky houses prior to air conditioning were actually desirable in parts of Houston, and you can kind of go to the Third Ward or some of these areas in Houston, and you can still see these old kind of leaky types where the envelope of the wall wouldn't have any insulation in it. It'd be boards on the outside, boards on the inside, and air would just flow through. But with as modernism sort of hit the scene, and we got buildings like the Lever House, suddenly that we were able to we did flip that logic on its head. So we get these hermetically sealed kinds of buildings where essentially the strategy is to just pump them full of cool air at extreme cost to energy loads globally and for the city, but also for building owners and so on. But the strange thing about these kinds of types, and this is a building in Houston that's very much kind of mimicking the Lever House, is that they have no shading and they don't really have operable windows or any way to kind of bring in the outside air. And if you've ever been to Houston in the middle of summer, it's not really desirable. You don't really want to be outside, to be honest. But at the same time, we sort of feel like there's an opportunity to kind of to play with some of those ideas and to say, well, maybe we would bring back some of the vernacular, but now kind of reformat it in a sense for a more modern project.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about these buildings is that they were, sort of imported to our environment, and then you sort of get this Lever House type building with huge condensing units on the top because there was this sort of belief that we were just going to condition the entire city.
What's interesting is that there was a kind of a movement, let's say in the 1960s, that was maybe even drawing from projects like the two that we just showed, where a lot of artists and sort of activist architect groups would create things like the House Rococo Oasis, where you essentially have this bubble, this conditioned bubble suspended on the side of a building with 2 palm trees in it, and anyone can kind of go in and sit there and feel like they're in this sort of oasis of cool or hot air. But there are Houston analogs to those kinds of projects that are maybe more literal. So the Bubble Boy is a kind of a famous case in Houston where David Vedder was born with an immunodeficiency that wouldn't allow him to be exposed to the outside air. So he absorbed pathogens almost instantly. So he essentially lived his entire life in a bubble, and I think he lived for 18 years in a bubble in Texas Children's Hospital right in Houston. And this was actually an isolated incident where his parents, with the help of some engineers at NASA, designed a suit that could take him outside. I mean, generally he lived his life inside a room, inside a bubble within a room. But in this case, they had this system where he could actually kind of go outside, but always within a purified sort of bubble of air. And it only happened once. And then they decommissioned the suit because he didn't like it. But that kind of ends up having a corollary to another House Rococo project, which is the Mind Expander helmet, or they made a series of these that were kind of called Mind Expander helmets. Sort of a preview in a weird way of like Google Glass or something like that. And then you have other Houston relations, such as the Apollo project, which was obviously a NASA project that sort of led to the Bubble Boy incident. But these things were happening sort of in real time as these other sort of art actions were going on. And then Buckminster Fuller's Dome over Manhattan, where he proposed that essentially the whole center of sort of Midtown Manhattan, you would cover it in a dome and condition it to 72 degrees, and then you could do away with all thermostats internally in buildings and even do away with windows altogether, because essentially you'd have a gigantic sort of conditioned space.
And so, not long after that time, Houston created its own version of that in the ASTRODOME. It was the 8th wonder of the world at the time. But right now it's no longer in use, and one of the big struggles is that to keep it running is a big drag in terms of resources and energy. It runs enough energy that it could sustain a city of more than 9,000 people. And I think what we find is not only is this problematic, but there are some interesting anecdotes that emerge from the ASTRODOME that we actually find, I think, pretty interesting about the region in which we work. There's a story that's sort of known about the structure. When it was first built, they developed at Texas A&M a specific species of Bermuda grass that was going to grow inside of the dome. And they were going to have Lexan panels on the structure to allow enough light in to keep the grass growing. And this worked, except that when they would water the grass, the humidity that the grass would give off would, of course, rise within the space, and then the degree to which they would cool the space would make it rain inside the ASTRODOME, which I think is incredibly fascinating. In fact, the engineers would brag that if they wanted to, they could cool it down enough and make it snow inside the building. And at that time, that was sort of the mentality of the city. But I think what's interesting about it is not the sort of excessive waste of that idea, but more that in this instance, it wasn't a designed condition. But the idea that if we understand how these processes work, that we can make it rain inside a building, that we can do all of these things, I think it has an incredible potential for the ways in which we hope we can reimagine our own projects, even if in just more modest ways. Obviously, these are some statistics that we all sort of understand about the energy consumption of our buildings, and certainly that buildings are one of the biggest contributors to it. And more specifically, both the residential and commercial construction of buildings is such a big consumer of fossil fuels. So, I think our work is sort of working within the sort of interior ecologies of these spaces, but also, trying to work against these statistics that we find within our current discipline.
Well, and we're also interested in, mining modernism in a way for types that work against the hermetically sealed bubble. So in Houston, if you drive around, you can find these buildings that are in some way sort of climatic even though they look very much like, let's say, the Lever House. So here you have a building with no operable windows, no shading systems, no real conversation in a way with the external environment, and then suddenly you have the American General Insurance building, which has a system of brise-soleils, a shading system. At one time it had operable windows. So it's maybe not 100% climatic, but it's sort of bending toward a climatic model. So we're interested in sort of figuring out where we can kind of pull that counter history out. And so that kind of brings us to our work, which has a lot to do with this issue of humid environments, hot humid environments. And so we kind of propose this model of a conceptual house that is an ongoing project, and it's finding its way into a lot of our work. But do you want to go back?
Oh, sorry.
So one of the things that we find interesting is that if you imagine a kind of a house or a building as a type of body, the body thermoregulates in certain ways and reaches a homeostasis through certain mechanisms. And buildings have the potential to be able to do that too in some respects. So we use radiation, convection, evaporation, and conduction to kind of either cool or heat our bodies. Buildings can operate in much the same way. So we've started a project in our work to kind of try to figure out how we can apply some of these strategies in order to get to arrive at maybe an actively passive model for conditioning. So in this case, this is a proposal for a house that would move away from the typical Houston house, which is this, it's hermetically sealed. It's a single kind of massive envelope that's filled with insulation. There's no shading really. I mean, if you go to Houston, surprisingly, you see virtually no shading on houses there. They're often stucco boxes with sealed windows. A lot of the newer houses built in Houston don't even have operable windows in them. No breezeways, no way to kind of regulate the external temperature and airflow. So we've thought about this as a way of kind of moving toward maybe a house or a building that would have these sort of nested layers where you'd have an external shading skin that would cool the surrounding air to some extent, and then you'd use these layers sort of symbiotically to arrive at maybe a 70-degree internal core that's actually fully conditioned, and that would begin to leak out, and you'd basically get benefit from that chilled core in the rest of the space or the building.
Yeah, I think ultimately what we're interested too is how it begins to create a kind of fluctuation within the volumes in which we use. So we imagine that a project like this would operate within our environment in which you would sort of accept the idea that if you wanted to be in a fully conditioned environment, that the space available to you becomes a kind of smaller footprint during those 3 or 4 months that become humid and harsh within our environment. And then you have certain levels of comfort for various activities, and that the sort of programmatic flows of a structure and how it's organized could have a kind of constantly changing or evolving relationship to these temperatures.
Well, one thing, I mean, we'll move into our work, but one thing that I always find interesting, and I came from California, and Houstonians, even though the climate, let's say six months of the year is perfectly nice, it's sort of Californian in a way, people don't live outdoors there at all. So, in California, everyone sort of lives outdoors, and because there's a sort of an evenness to the climate, but really in Houston, you can't do that, and people don't do that. They don't make use of external space. And there may be, in fact, no way to effectively do that. I mean, I think that's one of the questions we're asking in some of the projects we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, but I do think that is something that has emerged since the, probably middle of the 20th century, when there was a move towards more and more buildings that were these kind of hermetically sealed environments. A lot of the historic structures, we don't really have a picture to show you of it, within Houston were, and you find them still somewhat within the fabric of downtown. Certainly in New Orleans you find them, but it was a building type which would begin to build permanent awnings that would become a balcony for the second level onto the side of the building that would come all the way to the sidewalk. And all of those ground floor conditions would be a very high ceilinged condition to allow the heat to rise, obviously. And so they were all these sort of formal and they had structural impacts and all of these on the architecture. but to begin to make the environments work before the time of air conditioning. And I think that that was something that got removed from the city's culture. And I think we're interested in seeing how we can put some of those things back within that, because I remember my grandfather telling me stories of how he would have to bring multiple shirts to work because by lunch he might have sweat through the first one. So in any case, the BARNDOMINIUM was kind of a first project where we began to test some of these ideas. The client had a kind of a real interest being out in sort of the hillside outside of Houston, to sort of make sure that they had a kind of vernacular architecture or imagery to the building. And so we knew that that was sort of a constraint going into the project. But as we developed our version of that, we were interested in how the project could work in kind of multiple ways within the climate. So it was a live-work structure. The clients were interested in this property. You can see a picture of the site up above. In being able to go there on the weekends. They're a couple that's about to retire, and they would be able to live in half of this structure, and then they both had these sort of hobbies that they did, woodworking and glass blowing and things like that, that they wanted to be able to do. And we talked with them, and they said, well, we kind of pitched it to them as a cost-saving strategy, but we said, what if we were to think of underneath the sort of wrapper of this one project, sort of two halves to this project, and we would actively condition the front of this project, and we would set up the back portion of it, the workshop, to be something that could be passively conditioned throughout most of the year. And so that began to set up the diagram for how we developed this sort of live-work project that you can see here. And basically right at that doorway going into the eastern facade, the project, it sort of splits right down the middle, and you have a kind of actively conditioned project to the south and a more passively conditioned to the north.
As an aside, this is a phase one of what we're hoping is a two-phase project. So
yeah.
This will end up being a kind of a guest house workshop, and then there will be a main house at some point in the future, undisclosed point in the future.
Yeah. And so the wrapper for the house was much like that very first diagram that we were talking about before. And so we developed this rain screen facade, which began to become a kind of finished exterior material of an FSC certified IPE that we pulled away from the structure. And so you can see it as that kind of zone where we also located the gutter and the downspouts within the project. And since those are located both on the west and the east sides, it absorbs most of all of the direct light that's coming into the project, and then helps to further insulate the project by absorbing all of that immediate solar exposure on the outside. It also allows for a kind of almost like solar chimney effect to happen within that, where the heat rises out between it. And so you can see here the sort of interior of that workshop space, and then the workshop there on the right, which is a very different kind of environment, generally passively conditioned by opening the windows on the east and a big doorway on the north. And then the kind of efficient, apartment interiors of the actively conditioned space in the front of the structure. And sort of a picture of it from the back where we can load into the back of the structure. And the kind of overhangs that you see here on the northern face and on the southern face, especially on the southern face, create a way in which we're also dealing with the kind of direct exposure to light on those sides, and also we get the effect of that screening as it extends beyond the building structure.
Sure. So Botanica was a project that we got a grant to work on, actually, and it's a bioregenerative building air purification system, or what we ended up calling a breathing wall. And the idea behind this was that you would essentially have a kind of a panel that would have a planter box in it, but you would draw air through a soil medium, which wouldn't be typical soil that you'd buy at Home Depot, but is actually a kind of a designed soil matrix And that air that's being drawn through there would then be sequestered. The impurities in the air would be sequestered in the soil medium, and the plant life would then sort of treat that pollutant matter. So the idea behind this was essentially that you could take the system and apply it to an interior environment and use it as an alternative to a typical carbon filter or something like that. And we were sort of thinking of it as something that could be applied in houses, it could be applied in office spaces, it could be applied in schools, virtually anywhere. And the modularity of it would allow you to kind of stack it ad infinitum in some sense. So it could, it was sort of extensible and it could occupy any space really.
Yeah, and certainly there have been other projects that are looking at how plants can clean the air, in this regard, I think it's sort of looking at that as a model for something where the plants are constantly regenerating that growth medium, and constantly remaining as a kind of filter that is viable for the system. You can see the sort of beta version that we mocked up within the college, but I think what we were also interested in beyond just the pure air filtration was also how we could extend the idea of using plants to clean air as a modular system that we saw having an effect in terms of its ability to do multiple or to have sort of multiple effects within an interior environment. So the sort of growth panel that you see on the left would be able to plug into the fan panel, which would be adjacent to that. We also had developed the idea that there would be a drip water irrigation in it, and the sort of filler panel, what we were calling it, was to allow to run all of the infrastructure for the system and connect everything together. And then when that gets put together, here at the bottom, we saw it as a kind of system that could be aggregated in multiple ways. So for instance, actually I want to jump to this real quick, but if we if a client wanted to have something that was much more organized, it could be a system where they could develop just a kind of stripes within the wall. They could develop graphics. It could have a more random patterning to it. And to us, that was a kind of interesting second component to this, that we weren't necessarily driving what the project had to look like outside of developing these modules, but then the modules were able to be sort of deployed within a space as the client had interest.
So you can almost treat it like a textile or something?
Sorry.
Yeah. We also have proposed as a part of the system that you could either use, you could hook it into the existing building HVAC, so it could become a filtration system that would basically be linked to your return air duct, or you could have it be a sort of a freestanding unit, in which case it could, in theory, be an outdoor unit, and it could purify air in a small park or something like that.
Yeah, so for the installation that we had at the university, we had to use the fan panel because we didn't have an HVAC system to tie into, but we did have conversations with some HVAC consultants, and we're interested in the possibility of extending this research to building a mock-up that would tie into a return air system for a building.
And I mean, we're fully aware that there are other systems like this out there, and I think more increasingly you're seeing a lot of systems like this. So we're hoping to at some point in the near future commercialize this and take it to market in some way. And we've had some interest, in that regard. So we'll see in the next year or so where it goes.
So right about this time, we had, this is when we established the relationship with the Sierra Club. And so we actually were trying to pitch this to them at the time. However, they weren't interested in being a guinea pig. So they said that they'd pass on this particular version of an active filter. But we were able to work with them, which is the project that we're about to present.
So the Sierra Club project came about through a kind of a personal connection that I had at the Sierra Club, and they wanted to redo their lobby space, and so we sort of proactively made a proposal and just sort of submitted it to them. They didn't ask us, and because it's a slightly disorganized group, they saw our proposal and they had us fly out, and we pitched our idea to them. But at the same time that we were visiting, to pitch the idea, we saw the space that they were currently using as their lobby space, which looked like this. And it was grim. It was dark. It was filled with what we came to call the plant orphanage. So there are all these, like, whatever stray plants someone happened to have in their house, they'd drop in this space. And so it was sort of filled with these oddball pots and things, which had its own kind of charm. But it also had this problem of there was no reception to the reception. So you'd come in, you couldn't see the receptionist. She was sort of hiding behind a desk.
Well, and there was no way to sort of organize all this plant life that you found in there. And I think one thing that we saw when we first walked in was because they were so interested in having these plants within their environment, that at least if we couldn't implement the Botanica system, that there were opportunities there to begin to see how this project could begin to organize this sort of chaos that we saw here. In addition to, the receptionist.
So there's the receptionist hiding behind a wall. And then in the ceiling, there was just this crazy sort of network of pipes and cables and lighting, old lighting, husks of lighting that was just sort of left there and no one had ever removed. So we wanted to kind of clean that all up. And they said, yes, go ahead, move forward with it. So we started kind of looking at what we thought were some pretty interesting references in the Sierra Club's history. Both John Muir, who's a kind of an outstanding figure, but also this idea of sort of forestry and the Sierras themselves, and what could we kind of mine from that? I mean, it's the oldest and largest environmental organization in the world, and it seemed like they should have a lobby that was a compelling space to be in, and it would sort of say, hey, we're the oldest organization in the world. So we looked at the Sierras in a fairly literal way, and we created this kind of height field image of the Sierras that you can see Yosemite Valley and the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir and so on. And we said, well, maybe we could take this and do something with it. So we created some grasshopper definitions and ended up proposing to them a strategy that would allow us to kind of mask a lot of the junk in the ceiling plane. So the next image kind of shows this idea. So we created a series of points that would essentially be made out of reclaimed timber that would create this kind of ceiling cloud, essentially. And then we'd integrate lighting into it. We'd integrate all the services right into that ceiling cloud. And then there would be a desk made out of that reclaimed timber. And then we had this idea that we would create a perforated wall behind that would have the image of John Muir kind of pensively looking off into the distance. And that would be lit from behind with LED lighting. So somewhat expensive proposition, probably.
And so that idea became a mechanism for us not only to sort of create an identity for the space, but also to, as Matt had mentioned, sort of mask all of the sort of leftover infrastructure of the ceiling, and to become a way to also begin to locate lighting within that space. And I think ultimately, we hope there was at least one time a conversation that there's a phase 2 to this project. I don't know if that'll ever happen, but we hope that the sort of ceiling piece might find its way in, because we were interested in using, just like the desk, which is reclaimed Doug fir. We were able to, working with the contractor, find these huge old Doug fir timbers. The interest would be to do the same thing within the ceiling to create that installation.
And we should also say, do you mind going back to the first proposal?
No.
So we had no budget when we started the project, and we kept asking, is there a budget? And they said, well, we don't know what the budget is. You propose something to us and we'll tell you what the budget is. So we proposed this, and they said, well, you don't have a budget, but that seems too expensive. So we said, so finally we kind of wrangled them down, and they essentially said that we had $90,000 to do the project. And I mean, for those of you who have practiced for a long time, that's not a lot of money. I mean, in some commercial interiors, that'll buy you a desk. So we had to get creative within that budget, and there was, as Jason said, this idea that maybe down the line we'd be able to do the cloud, they'd find more money. But essentially what we were able to do is to say, well, maybe we make the LED panel, the sort of routed CNC milled LED panel into just a simple super graphic on the back wall. We still use the timbers, we embed LED lighting in a routed groove in the timbers, and then we do this. Andrew will recognize the detail of the Allied Works desk, but this aluminum, this sort of folded aluminum plate for the desktop. So that that sort of generated the scheme, and then we hung this. Initially, it was a much more dense system of lights that was going to form a datum, and we would sort of replace that canopy. But again, that sort of got valued engineered out because I think these were like $12 light fixtures. And we had, I don't know, 1,000 of them or something. So it added up very quickly. So we ended up, I think, with 100 or less.
Yeah, and I think our priorities were, if you know, looking back at those original images, was to you know, if nothing else, to be able to sort of clean up the space for them, give them a space that has a lot more light. It was very sort of dark and drab the first time that we visited it, and to begin to try to rebrand the organization as something that is taking a sort of new path within the organization.
Well, and then one thing that was slightly sort of controversial, I mean, the Sierra Club is it's a very progressive organization, but it's conservative in a lot of ways. And I think people had become very accustomed to that lobby space. And the change was difficult for some people to accept, as minor as it seems probably to you, to a lot of you guys. But what was especially sort of shocking to everyone was these sort of lime green entryways that we created to the, if you've been there, back into the back offices, which were meant to sort of punctuate a portal. But we got a call when they painted them, and the thing wasn't done at all, and they said, can we change the lime green? We want something more neutral, like a more drab color. And so we pushed back a bit, and so the lime green is still there for what it's worth.
And it was interesting to sort of, we actually were in the neighborhood today, walking around the city, and said, hey, let's run up there and check it out. And it was interesting too to sort of see the way that they've sort of moved into it. We can't say that they haven't completely brought some plants back in that are in pots, but interestingly enough, they sort of live on the desk in the parts of the cantilever that are sort of these opportunities to inhabit. So I think that was kind of fun.
So we sort of conditioned them to put the plants in an organized way.
A little more organization, yeah.
This is a project. This was a competition that we submitted for a couple of years ago, and we were selected as a finalist. We called it the PRISM Cloud. It was for an energy generating landscape outside in the United Arab Emirates, outside of Abu Dhabi. And the brief for the competition, and some of you may have entered it, was to create a sort of a landscape art piece that could be inhabited and used by the public, but would also generate energy. And I think the brief said that it should power something like 6,000 houses. So what we developed was a concept of these concrete piers that could be sort of dropped into place that would fit on a semi-truck bed, and you could string a steel cable net between them, and then on that cable net you'd be able to hang these solar panels that would be thin film solar panels that would also be laid over a wind scoop. So the prevailing breezes in that area are from the northeast, and essentially if you orient the wind scoop so that it catches the prevailing breezes, the other side of it actually is perfectly oriented toward the sun. So the idea is that you could this thing would be completely modular, and you could kind of extend it across the landscape and array it, however you saw fit. And then there were some other passive strategies, but the whole idea is that it would link to the seafront, which is right there, and you could actually have some of these sitting out in the water and so on.
And I think in addition to that, we were sort of interested, when confronted with a kind of desert landscape, is how we began to respond to anything. I mean, generally, as designers, we're responding to a context or some kind of condition that is informing the way that we work. And in this case, I think for us, the idea of all the sort of immaterial aspects of the site, be it light, wind, we were very conscious of trying to make all of those things visible in some way. So the sort of prismatic conditions of that canopy, the way that it would bend light, or the sort of wind scoop aspect of it, and the way that the tensioned steel canopy would begin to sort of move or flutter within that. We were kind of interested in those aspects and making people aware of those immaterial conditions of the site.
And in theory, just as a note on that competition, in theory they were supposed to build the winning entry, or at least some part of it, but I don't know that ever happened. There were some really, really wonderful entries to the competition, but as a result, that initiative, which I think was called the Land Art Generator Initiative, has moved on to other sites. So I think the last competition was maybe at Fresh Kills, and they have an ongoing initiative of competitions, which in theory they will build, at some point in the future.
So about a year ago, or maybe a little more, we were given the opportunity at our university to redesign a desk for the reception area. we've just had a new dean come into our university, and so she was very interested in beginning to sort of change the initial perception that people had when they came to the building. If any of you have been to our building, it's a postmodern building that Philip Johnson did, which is a copy of Ledoux, and so forth. And so I think this sort of, she wants to do anything she can to work against that.
It has a gigantic Parthenon hood ornament on the top of it,
yeah.
Which, I mean, it's worth seeing. It's actually a pretty cool building in some respects, if you can get past the pastel colors. So,
so in any case, we were given a brief that had a number of conditions to it. They needed to have a sort of workspace. They wanted a display area, they needed a work counter, and there were all of these sort of surfaces that they were interested in addition to a kind of media or display panel that the school could begin to put up information about the college as a kind of running image in the background behind the receptionist. And so we were sort of given all of these sort of programmatic constraints to look at, and we started to have a discussion about how as a kind of landscape or as a surface, all of these various functional heights could be adjoined. So we started to look at sort of the height at which we would display these things and so forth, and kind of wrapped it all into this one form, and then coiled it around this sort of wall panel that we were interested in looking at a kind of material that would, the dean also had an interest in sort of making use of this new building that we have at the university, which is our sort of digital fabrication facility. And so we had sort of looked at a few materials and thought that Corian would be an interesting material to work with, and developed a kind of toolpath pattern that would sort of register the insertion of the screen into this wall. And initially we kind of developed frankly, a more complex kind of patterning within our design. And because our CNC mill at the time was down, we were going to have to work with someone in the city to have them execute and fabricate that wall piece. And so it was costing the university for every hour that the thing was going to be milling, or every minute that it was milling. And so when we ran the tool pass for the first one, it came out to be something like 20 or more hours to do it, because it was a more fluid surface. And therefore we had to change multiple bits, and you guys probably know how that goes. So what we decided to do was within that to essentially keep the pattern the same, but to say what could we do to sort of economize or make it more efficient. And so all that we did was to take these sort of simple lines and begin to look at this sort of oversized V-bit, that if we looked at it more in terms of how deep we plunged the bit, would create these different effects. And so we developed a kind of range from anywhere from a 1/4 inch plunge to a 1/2 inch plunge, and were able to sort of recreate that sort of wavy surface that we had initially in a simple kind of V-bit move that I don't know how long it took to go through the Corian, but when we tested it through the MDF here, the whole piece took about 15 minutes because it was just ripping through that MDF. So you can imagine the sort of cost efficiencies that we were able to achieve in terms of going from hours of time to something that in the final Corian piece maybe took an hour by itself. So so that was a kind of fun way for us to begin to see how we could not only begin to work with these technologies, but to begin to make them efficient and deploy them as economically as we could for the school. And this was sort of the final result of that.
So this is another project that actually is currently under construction for a Russian client of ours. We called it the Nested House. He was interested, he lives in Houston, but he was interested in having a sauna in the house, which is kind of an odd thing in Houston because in the summertime it's a sauna outside for 3 or 4 months of the year. So, I don't think we tried to convince him not to do that. We thought it was sort of an interesting problem to kind of grapple with. And so what we did was we created a design that had these layers of material, each of which would have a different kind of conditioning quality to it. So the exterior layer, is a metal skin, a cool roof, essentially, that would allow this kind of skin system to breathe. This is the south facade right there, and that's the north facade. And the idea is that it would kind of wrap over a kind of outdoor dining area with a barbecue and so on. And then the second layer is the sort of the main living area, which we would clad in Siberian larch, which is a really great material for sort of thermal absorption. It's often used in saunas. But we also found out that it's extremely rot resistant, and it weathers very well. So, and it's used, throughout Europe. All those kind of what looks like pine buildings are actually generally larch. So those beautiful Swiss projects generally are larch. So the living area is wrapped in larch. The interior core area, which is sort of where the bathrooms are and so on, it gets a little cooler in there. We'll use a hard coat plaster, so you can actually, there's a kind of a sensible quality to the wall. When you touch it, you can sense the coolness of the material. And then when you go into the sauna, again, there's this sort of this material, the larch, that responds very well to hot climates.
So, we sort of began to look at this not only in terms of the way that the material would perform, i.e. the Siberian larch won't rot, but also the way in which we were very interested, as Matt was just saying, in sort of the way the sort of haptic experience of touching it and the tactile quality of it. In saunas, it's great because when you sit down, because it's not absorbing that temperature, you're not going to burn yourself or get anything like that. So we developed this as a kind of drawing to explain to the client the sort of motivations behind the material palette that we were developing for the project.
There's in the previous image, you can kind of see there's some steel in the project because we have this big cantilever on the east side, and then that's a big sort of glass wall. And the interior is meant to be very open to the north, but very close to the south. One of the other interests of the client is there's a freeway about a mile south of here. So he's seeing this as essentially a very expensive noise buffer from his main house, which is actually outside of the image on the right. And
they have a real interest in being able to use this in a way in which sort of oscillating between sort of the outdoor kitchen, which is this covered space underneath the extended roof, and the kind of interior space, interior environment of the living area, and sort of being able to, in the months that aren't sort of uninhabitable or difficult to be inhabited in the summer months, to open up that wall there and sort of use it as sort of one big room between inside and outside. And it's currently under construction, so we were out on site yesterday, and this is where that's at. And so finally, one of the most recent projects that we've been able to complete is a house in one of the historic neighborhoods of Houston. In fact, some of these pictures were just taken a few days ago because we've recently completed it and are working on the punch list. Yeah,
it's his house.
But there was a kind of interest with the project in looking at the ways that some of the ideas that we've been talking about, going back to sort of the vernacular dog trot, could begin to make its way into the project. And so, here as being given the brief, or in this case, I guess we sort of generated that brief, we said, the old dog trot homes were generally 600 or 800 square feet, 2 rooms, one you lived in, one you slept in. As much as my wife and I would like to live that minimally, we needed a little more space than that. So we knew we were going to have a few bedrooms and things like that. And so we were wondering how to make something like the breezeway operate within this sort of contemporary program that we were looking at. And so we became quickly interested in this idea that, well, if one breezeway is good, 4 must be awesome. And so what if we were to array 4 breezeways across the length of this sort of simple bar building as a way not only to begin to try and passively condition the house, but as a way to begin to spatially organize and begin to break up what is otherwise a kind of really long bar building that spatially would operate kind of like a big bowling alley. So it was a pretty simple diagram for the initial operation. We, it's kind of counterintuitive in the Gulf Coast region, but we tend to pull structures away from the north rather than the south. In other words, we're using the architecture to create a shadow over the site, in part because while normally you would want to maybe open up the architecture to the south because you have a lot of control over that sun, most of the time we're just trying to keep things shaded and as cool as possible. So we open it up to the north. That also gives us the benefit of all of the indirect light. So when you see the sort of interior photos of the project, there's generally no direct light within the project. Then we perforate it with 4 breezeways along the section. And then there were a few contextual issues that we sort of bent the form at the back because there's a garage off of an alley that we can pull into. But it's very narrow, so we kind of thought of it as angled parking in a parking lot where we can back out in a more efficient way and head out the other end of the alley. And then because this created this really long sort of yard to the north, we broke it up with the lower breezeways by sort of extending that space out of the building to create a front yard that is more the sort of leisure yard, and then a garden that will grow vegetables and things in the back. And so we saw these sort of blue volumes, these sort of erosions in the project as rooms in and of themselves. So they sort of live within the volume of the building, but yet at the same time they are a kind of exterior space. But when, so say 6 months out of the year when it is really great, we were able to open up those interior environments and sort of live out in these spaces. So actually, I just had talked to my wife yesterday when we got here, and it was just starting to get, it was the first day we were able to open the house back up, and she was out in the back breezeway back there having a drink, maybe celebrating that I was out of the house or something. And so then we were also interested in sort of the materiality of that project, and so the perforations is not only a kind of diagram for the spatial conditions of the house, but we started to look for a material that we could use that was perforated in and of itself. And so we used that within the siding of the house. And this has an interesting optical effect where, sort of the lit side is always the opaque condition. And so during the day, as you can see, it's sort of largely opaque from the outside. But then as it switches to night, it sort of inverts itself and sort of turns itself inside out. But on the flip side, when I'm in my office or we're inside of the house, we can see out of the house when it's opaque like this from the outside. So it becomes a kind of dynamic screening surface for the house, both to shield the solar, but also to mask our views. We can sort of watch the neighborhood.
And in another sense, the material palette for the house is pretty common in Houston. I mean, you see a lot of cedar, you see a lot of corrugated metal, I mean, tons of corrugated metal roofs. So it's not totally atypical that the house is made out of these materials in that climate, even though more and more, the house next door to these guys is a stucco house, and you see more and more of that there.
Yeah. So the sort of typical 2-story section we started to work against so the breezeways became a spatial organization device you can see in the section. So we punctuated that, and then we opened up these double height living spaces that began to create privacy between the bedrooms. And then we began to sort of play with the floor plate to shift those relationships within the section. This was in part because we wanted to supply air from the ground, which is uncommon in our region, but it's also seemingly counterintuitive that you would try to force cool air down through a warm space. So in this case, we're actually just supplying it at the ground. It works great in terms of an immediate sort of cooling of the space. And then the only thing we have to be careful to do is to return air off the ceiling so that we don't get a break in temperature where the lower part of our spaces stays cold and the upper part stays hot and humid. And then I've seen spaces like that where you actually get a kind of line of mold that will show up in the wall. So you have to be careful when you do this, but as long as you're returning air off the top of the space, it works quite well.
Well, a lot of the old buildings pre-air conditioning in Houston are very tall volumes. There's a place that we occasionally get sandwiches called Carter and Cooley, which was built in the 1930s. And it's like 15 or 16 feet high on the interior, and they have big fans always whirring in the space. And now it's an air-conditioned space, but back in the old days, that was their way of kind of making sure that the hot air would be kind of gathered at the ceiling, and you'd get a cool cool buffer down at the bottom of the space. So I think in this house, I think that was part of the mentality too, that we would create these big open air volumes that would allow heat to rise.
And the other thing that was interesting about that is, so what started as kind of just a hunch, maybe if we made 4 breezeways and cut them through the house, that they would be these interesting kind of interior environments that would give a kind of gradient range of living spaces within the home, and would extend our living space such that while it's not a sort of extremely huge interior square footage, we were able to sort of create a house that feels much bigger than the square footage that it has. But in addition, by displacing breezeways in section, which has its own series of challenges, because one of my wife's mandates was that we won't walk outside to go back inside. But that what was interesting was that by displacing some of those breezeways vertically in the section, it also takes advantage of stack effect within those double height spaces. So we imagine that through the combination of the passive breezes that are blowing through the breezeways and the kind of taking advantage of the section for stack effect, we'd create this sort of super breezeway that would draw the air out in an even more effective way. And having now spent a summer within the space, it works really well. I would say that the house interior square footage is 2,500 square feet, and in the summer months, our highest electricity bill was $150, and in the spring, we've gotten as low as like $55 or $60, right around in there. And so and that's in a combination of not only not having to deal with excessive sort of air conditioning loads. This was taken just before we finished construction on the outside. A sort of shot of that at night from there, and you can kind of see in this shot the breezeway coming through within that living space on the second floor. But it's also because during the day we don't have to flip on any lights within the space, so we're not taking a high sort of electricity load on the house either in terms of our lighting. And so at the end of the day, as the light is coming back through that sort of perforated screen, you can see the sort of dynamic lighting effects that it has within the space. And we treat this as sort of an extension of our living space in the afternoons to sit out and be a part of the neighborhood, because the historic sort of fabric of the area is such that it's the older homes with the sort of wraparound porches, and everybody's out on the street in that way, and that's our sort of way to participate in that part of the neighborhood life. And so some of the details throughout the project, and that sort of interior double height volume looking back towards the entry door and seeing out through that perforated.
What's a little hard to see here, but you can see it in the plan, is that there's a kind of a double stair. So one of those stairs goes up to the front to a guest room, and the other stair goes back to 2 bedrooms in the back, which is a nice way to kind of partition or zone the space so that you have, you can keep your guests away in a way, mm-hmm. or they have their own kind of private area at the front. Yeah.
And just some other shots as we're finishing up the inside. That's our punch list right there on the wall right there. So we're still working on a few things on the inside. But also this shot maybe showcases how that sort of shifting in the sort of ground condition of the plan at the ground level creates a situation where we're connected to all of these spaces. So it's essentially one big space, but it does give a sort of autonomy to each individual space within the house. A few other shots of that. The south side of the project.
The south side, which is, it's a very thick envelope, which kind of protects against that beating sun in Houston.
Yeah, so we took advantage of the detail that we had in the barn where we ran the sort of drainage, the roof drainage and the downspouts within that assembly. But what that allowed was that within that thickness, there was a kind of natural depth to it, that all of the windows are pretty shallow on that south side. The breezeways, of course, are quite large. And there's a natural shading to that depth. And so it allows the house to sort of always have this sort of indirect character to it. And that's it.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.